Welcome to Philosophy 2005. This is the second part of our reading and virtual discussion of Immanuel Kant's essay and answer to the question, what is enlightenment? We are going to begin today on the bottom of the first page of the PDF of our text for today. So the Kant and answer to the question, what is enlightenment PDF? The first page, the bottom of the page, this is a 4-page PDF, by the way. The bottom of that first page, I want us to look at this paragraph at the bottom that begins, but that, and ends with great unthinking masses. But that, so these are Kant's words here in his essay. But that a public should enlighten itself is more possible, indeed this is almost inevitable, if only it is left its freedom. So political freedom, he thinks, is all that's needed for a public to enlighten itself. Turns out being left with political freedom is hardly something the public can count on. And so, even though Kant is saying enlightenment is almost inevitable, we need to pay attention to this condition, right? If only the public is left its freedom. That has not been the case, in my view, over the past few hundred years, and therefore, a public has not managed to enlighten itself. Anyways, let's move forward now. There will always be, Kant says, a few independent thinkers, even among the established guardians of the great masses. Sure, this is true today, just as it was in Kant's time, who, after having themselves cast off the yoke of tutelage, minority, immaturity, all these different translation choices for the German Unmündigkeit here. So, there will always be a few independent thinkers, Kant is arguing here, even among the established guardians, who, after having themselves cast off the yoke of immaturity, will disseminate the spirit of a rational valuing of one's own worth, and of the calling of each individual to think for himself. What should be noted here, I mean, think about this: the disseminating the spirit of a rational valuing of one's own worth, and the calling of each individual to think for himself. There's a sense in which that is what's, that happens when you enter a university system like ours. Okay, as you come in, you are encouraged to think of yourself as a human being with dignity and potential who can sort of, accomplish whatever you set out to do and realize your aspirations. Also, the calling of each individual to think for himself. You are encouraged, required even, to think for yourself what it is you want to do with your life, and then try to formulate a study plan here at the university for how you can make some progress towards that goal. And it's not something that anyone else can really do for you, right? So, there's a sense in which we find this even operative here in the university. What should be noted here, Kant goes on to say, though. So I just want to give us an example of what this is like. You might wonder, right, where in the world has a spirit of rationally valuing my own worth or feeling a call to think for myself? Where can I find this? Certainly not in many of our public institutions of K-12 education, for instance. Does not seem to be too much the case there. So just as an example, right, I want you to think about how things shift when you come to a university. So let's continue to read Kant here. What should be noted here is that the public, which was previously put under this yoke by the guardians, the yoke of allowing others to think for us and to solve our problems for us. What should be noted here is that the public, which was previously put under this yoke by the guardians, may subsequently itself compel them to remain under it, if the public is suitably stirred up by some of its guardians who are themselves incapable of any enlightenment. So harmful is it to implant prejudices, because they finally take their revenge on the very people who, or whose predecessors were their authors. You are not wrong, Kant. We are living this right now, with this eruption, for instance, of racism in the 21st century. Thus, a public can achieve enlightenment only slowly, A revolution may well bring about a falling off of personal despotism and of avaricious or tyrannical oppression. We can get rid of a king, right? He's not wrong, right? A French Revolution here about, not even 10 years later was to do this very thing in France, but never a true reform in one's way of thinking. Instead, new prejudices will serve just as well as old ones to harness the great unthinking masses. I mean, my God, Kant is essentially predicting the 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 way in which the French Revolution, moving too quickly, was then itself superseded by a counter-revolution, and a sort of new version of monarchy, starting with Napoleon and then Napoleon III around 1848. So there's a lot going on here in what Kant is talking about, but he's clearly is perceptively noting something that history, at least in one case, the French Revolution, did bear out. Now, so what is he discussing here? He's bringing up something that threatens the possibility of public enlightenment. The public has been conditioned and trained by its guardians, most of them at least, to think in certain ways and believe certain things. Think of how an elementary school teacher will teach you to do math problems in a certain way and to believe certain things about American history, for instance, and to trust the experts. Now, if a few enlightened guardians begin spreading a message that what is most important is for each person to think for him or herself, then other guardians, the more numerous ones who are used to telling others what to think and do not like the idea that the public which they command might become free of them, may very well tell the public these enlightened guardians are a threat to public order, and Kant concludes, the public itself may then, obeying the unenlightened guardians, punish the enlightened ones and remain immature. So this danger is apparently supposed to show us that a public can achieve enlightenment only slowly, and that a sudden revolution may get rid of a tyrant or some particular form of oppression, but cannot by itself achieve, quote, a true reform in our way of thinking. Instead, new prejudices serve just as well as old ones to harness the great unthinking masses. So I just want us to think here, if we agree with Kant or not. Is there something about the achievement of enlightenment that requires gradual progress rather than simple, decisive, critical actions, such as a revolution? Would unenlightened guardians and the unthinking masses always prevent enlightenment? Why or why not? So what I'm suggesting here is Kant might have a little more work to do to establish the plausibility of gradual progress. This issue he's describing here, in which he does seem to be aware of a certain kind of class struggle, and a struggle really among the ideologists for the established order, the class of guardians, right? Between guardians who would like to see things change, for instance, and guardians who are complicit with the status quo and are opposed to any radical changes to our economy, to our politics, etc. So, it's not exactly clear reading this why we should have patience while we wait for the enlightenment slowly to come to fruition. If guardians are locked in a struggle, right, with the public an uncertain third factor in their struggle, swinging now one way, now another, depending on the guardians involved to which the public is listening, how do we know we aren't just taking a sort of one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, in any case, not sort of on a trajectory of inevitable progress, but instead perhaps stuck. Okay, so Kant, throughout the rest of this essay, remains optimistic about the possibility of public enlightenment. He claims all that is necessary for public enlightenment is something that seems fairly simple: political freedom, right? What does this amount to? Well, as Kant puts it, quote, it's the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. That's what he has in mind. So long as there is the freedom to make use to make public use of one's reason in all matters public enlightenment is virtually inevitable. Now, a critical note here, right? Having the freedom to make public use of your reason in all matters is different than having the public use of one's reason in all matters really genuinely, in a material sense, facilitated. For example, you or I have the freedom to make the public use of our reason in, if not all matters, at least most, many. I mean, there's a national security state. We may not make public use of our reason when it comes to certain matters anymore at all. But when it comes to, I don't know, for instance, who the next president of the United States is going to be, who the next governor of the state of California is going to be, what sorts of city officials we have, and what sorts of projects we should prioritize locally. For instance, we all have the freedom to sort of show up in public and have our say. That's not the same thing as really being able to make the public use of reason in all matters. We need, for instance, time to consider these matters carefully and look at the evidence and all the information out there. We also need to have not merely the time, but also the energy. That is, we can't be exhausted from overworking ourselves and dealing with having to care for family members and whatnot. If you end up spending 60 hours a week or more doing a lot of work, you may not have much energy left over to use your freedom, to use your reason publicly in all matters, and thus be politically free in this sense. So many of us, for instance, have the freedom to do certain things, but we don't really have the material conditions that make this genuinely a real possibility for us. In fact, being politically free in the way Kant has in mind here is experienced as a burden by many people who simply don't feel they have the time, energy, or the knowledge, the resources to obtain the knowledge to make informed decisions, and it just, to them, strikes them as a lot of difficult work in addition to everything they already are doing. So Kant seems to, take it for granted that we may have some demanding work, but we also have significant amounts of leisure time and the ability to sort of take care of ourselves well enough and take care of our health well enough that we can manage both demanding careers and be active public citizens. Is this really something that I think, I want us to think whether this is really true for many of us today? Okay, so Kant, he's going to eventually come to treat a question I want us to think a little bit more about here. This is where he contrasts living in an enlightened age with living in an age of enlightenment. Now, Kant claims we live in, and on the handout I ask you to figure this out and sort of make a decision. I'm not going to decide this for you, right? But Kant, right, in his text is claiming that we live in an age of enlightenment. In his time, the 1780s, when he's writing this, he's claiming at that time we, and who the we is even there is not exactly clear. I mean, he's addressing basically the European bourgeoisie, that is, professors, doctors, lawyers, merchants, the class of human beings who could obtain a university education in his time, were literate, belonged to different reading societies, and would like to get together and argue and debate various political, economic, social matters. So he's claiming that in the 1780s, we, that is he and his fellow European bourgeoisie, the middle class roughly, live in an age of enlightenment, but not an enlightened age. What is the difference here? Well, an enlightened age is one in which people can use their own reason without the guidance of others, in which everyone, or nearly everyone, is rational and autonomous. An age of enlightenment, which is the age, that he thinks he lives in, is one in which there is still guidance from above, right? Guardians, heteronomy, as you would put it, right? Letting others decide for us. but in which, quote, the field is now being opened for them to work freely in this direction, the public, even guardians, right? We can all work freely towards total autonomy, and that the hindrances to universal enlightenment or to humankind's emergence from its self-incurred condition of minority, tutelage, immaturity, are gradually becoming fewer. So that's his claim, is that at present we're in an age of enlightenment in which there are still issues with authoritarianism and heteronymous determination, and yet these problems are gradually becoming fewer. I want us to think, I mean, here we are, more than 300 years later. Do we share Kant's optimism here that things are essentially getting better when it comes to public enlightenment, to the dissemination of the ability to think critically for ourselves and without needing others to do this for us? And that's not a question I can answer for you. It's one I want you to think about yourself critically here. Now, if I can just get my mouse to work, we might be able to proceed. Okay. I want to just discuss a little bit of what Kant talks about at the very end of this essay when he is discussing progress. Kant clearly has an optimistic view of human nature and history, perhaps best summed up in his claim. And let me find this claim in our reading. So that I don't mislead you here. Here we go. This is on page 4 in, not the last paragraph, and not the one before the last or the penultimate, but the one just before that. So the paragraph on the final, on page 4 that begins, a prince who does not find it beneath himself, and ends, keep them in it. I want us to just look at the last sentence there on page 4 of this paragraph. Here's Kant's optimism about progress in a nutshell. People, here's the quote, people gradually work their way out of barbarism of their own accord if only one does not intentionally contrive to keep them in it. I think in a nutshell this gives us the problem with his optimism. He's not wrong, I don't think. People will gradually work their way out of what he's calling barbarism. Here we could insert things like racism, sexism, classism, and whatnot. Here, people will gradually work their way out of these various forms of ignorance and violence of their own accord, if only one does not intentionally contrive to keep them in it. That's a big if. A lot hinges on that if. Kant's optimism is rooted in his belief that we should not expect to be intentionally kept in barbarism. I'm not so sure we can share that optimism here in the 21st century, thinking through the legacy of the 20th century, the terrible wars, the Holocaust, thinking as well of the crises we are faced with today and our inability to respond adequately to these crises, whether we're talking about this latest virus outbreak or the climate crisis. Can we share Kant's optimism here that all we have to do is leave people alone, essentially, to be free and to freely express themselves, and they will gradually work their way out of barbarism? Even if he's right, it's not exactly clear how people are to be left alone to learn to think for themselves or to be encouraged to think for themselves critically. That is precisely what doesn't seem to be happening. In fact, if anything, it is becoming harder, I think, to be left alone to develop autonomous thought. One thing that's changed drastically from Kant's time is the amount of conditioning and messaging we are constantly receiving, something that was not, there was a lot more privacy in Kant's time, at least for the middle class. And you were not constantly bombarded by advertisements, marketing, political rhetoric, and all sorts of messaging. Are people left alone with their own thoughts? I think we are conditioning people to not even want to be left alone with their own thoughts. And this is actually something that many people now are afraid of, right? And flee from the moment they they are left alone with their own thoughts. The first thing they want to do is seek out a distraction so that they are not left in their own thoughts, feeling, as they put it, bored. So, I'm not convinced that we can share Kant's optimism. See what you think, though. I'm not here to tell you how you have to think. I mean, this would be the very worst text to teach and then impose a reading on you. So I want us to think, right? Do you agree with Kant's claim here or not? If you do, why? How would you support this kind of claim, right? That if we just let people alone, they will come to learn to think for themselves effectively. We just let them have political freedom. That's a big if, right? Again, have most people ever really been left with any kind of effective political freedom in history? This is a question that I'm very concerned about. It's not clear to me that they have, ever. Okay. Even in this country, for example, it's generally the case that only half the population bothers to vote in elections, so generally the winning candidate has something like roughly a quarter of the populace's support. And apparently that's just fine. It's hard to call something majority rule, though, when it seems like from the outset it's only ever half the population. Anyways, Kant then goes on, right? He's going to go on and make another very questionable claim here. He claims that an enlightened ruler will be able to say to the people, argue as much as you will, and about what you will, only obey. He's looking for a ruler that would have this as their motto. I will let the people discuss freely whatever they like. And to, really have a real discussion here in a debate, and to offer proposals, and to state objections. And then the trade-off then is, but you would then must obey the law and government policies. You will have a say, you will have a vote, and whether things go the way you want or not, right, you are now on the hook to obey. Do we still feel like we have the possibility of an enlightened ruler or a government that would really hold this to be true and attempt to really facilitate it in the public? I mean, it seems like a large function of mass media, the corporate media in this country, whether it's Fox or CNN and all the like, is to precisely to prevent people from being able to argue as much as you will and about what you will. Instead, what happens is people get their talking points from their preferred guardians, and then they repeat and parrot what they've heard from their masters. And then they also don't want to obey, right, either, because they don't feel they have a legitimate role here in forming policy to begin with. So we have a lot of ineffective arguments happening where people aren't really talking to each other but past each other, and then on the flip side we don't really have many people wanting to obey their government right now. Instead, you find people criticizing their government and arguing for disobeying as much as you can and getting away with it as much as possible due to the government's perceived illegitimacy, whatever side of the spectrum you're on. So I want us to think here in closing whether or not the freedom to argue about what we want as we want to, is the freedom to argue enough if we must still always obey? If we're ordered to do something unjust, for instance, Kant says we can always resign or quit, but we can never, while working in a specific position that we've agreed to in a contract, refuse to obey. So it's about honoring our promises, being honest. We've agreed to things when we take on jobs, and therefore we must do what they require and obey. And if we have a problem with what's happening in our workplaces, for instance, we can only later, when we're no longer at work, speak or write critically about what is happening within society. Now, one thing to think about here is Kant effectively trying to rule out civil disobedience. And I want us to think, are we sometimes justified in refusing to obey orders in our workplaces, and to argue even there in our workplaces about the particular work we're doing in society, the way that work is organized, who's benefiting from the arrangement, who's being left out or shortchanged, right? I want us to think about this, is our political freedom something that we must always do outside of a workplace, outside of a university classroom? Is this something that we sort of can't bring into professional settings? How does this fit with a tradition of civil disobedience that would require us to occupy and stage actions in places like this? Anyway, something to think about in conclusion. I want to go ahead and just wrap up our discussion of Kant's What is Enlightenment essay, and I hope you found this somewhat helpful. Thanks.